Good day, and thank you very much for being afforded this opportunity to make a presentation at this Digital Festival of Construction in Africa. My presentation today is going to focus on strengthening inter-Africa cooperation and partnerships in the construction industry. My contents, I'll give a brief introduction on this topic. I'll touch secondly on continental and regional infrastructure development framework and how it impacts on the construction industry. Thirdly, I will talk a little bit about who's financing Africa's infrastructure development. And number four, I will speak about efforts to accelerate implementation of continental and regional infrastructure projects, particularly with emphasis on the Presidential Infrastructure Champion Initiative. And number five, I will then touch a little bit on the construction and infrastructure development trends in Africa for the year 2018 and 2019 to look a little bit at the numbers, looking at who owns, looking also at who is funding infrastructure in the continent, and also who is building and constructing things around the continent. And number six, I will then share with you, we'll look at a map to highlight where the major growth nodes in the continent and development corridors and what potential opportunities are there, even in this era of COVID-19, for companies to pursue opportunities. And lastly, I will speak about what we all need to do, both within the continent and partners from outside, about harnessing partnership through a more comprehensive and holistic value chain approach, and I will conclude thereafter. Africa infrastructure development, as we all know, is the bedrock of economic growth and development for Africa. It is a catalyst and enabler for investment and a major contributor for the reduction of poverty across the continent, because it can also help in creating significant numbers of jobs directly, but also indirectly. According to the African Development Bank, they estimate that Africa needs between $130 to $170 billion per year to address its infrastructure backlog. So that's quite a significant amount. And the Africa Consortium for the Infrastructure Consortium for Africa mentions that about $100 billion was committed for Africa infrastructure operations in 2018. So since the beginning, or let me say the turn of the century, we have really begun to see a significant increase in investments in infrastructure. It's still not what one would have liked and expected, but I think the situation is much better than in the previous year. And the results thereof, we can begin to see it in the very positive economic growth that we have experienced in the continent for the past few years. So if you look at the graph here on the right, just at the bottom left-hand corner, if you are looking, right-hand corner, if you're looking at the presentation, if you look at the numbers from 2014 to 2018, it has continued to grow with the exception of 2016, where it went down a little bit at around $66 billion, but it then picked up as well. So it sustainably continued to grow and increase, which opens up significant opportunities. Now, the reason for that growth is that with the launch of the new Partnership for Africa's Development in 2001, and also the transformation of the African, what was then known as the Organization of African Unity, into the African Union, the continent and regions, what we call the regional economic communities, began to develop a framework for the development of Africa's infrastructure. So it was like and this framework consists of a number of national and regional projects of significance, and which are designed to link and interconnect African countries one with the other. And the program is known as the AU NEPAD Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, abbreviated PIDA. The priority action plan of this program was broken down into two sort of buckets. The one bucket to be implemented from 2010 to 2020, and PAP2, which is the second bucket, is to be implemented from 2020 to 2040. The truth is, when it comes to implementation, most of the projects that were included in the portfolio of projects to be implemented by the end of this year have unfortunately not yet materialized. And there is actually a need to begin to relook and review and ask the questions as to why, so that we could then take the necessary action. Now, PIDA 1, what with the program, the Priority Action Plan for 2010-2020, consisted of 51 programs divided into 433 projects in various sectors, and this was valued at about $68 billion. So that's rough estimate. Now, Priority Action Plan number 2, which is currently under development, it is estimated the delivery of both Priority Action Plan 1 up to 2020 and Priority Action Plan 2 up to from 2020 to 2040 is valued at roughly at about $360 billion. So that's a whooping significant amount. What sectors does it cover? It covers energy, ICT, transport sector, so your airports, your ports, your rail, your roads, transboundary water resources, and etc. But we also know that when it comes to construction, it's not just these mega projects. We also talk about housing, we talk about roads, both primary and secondary roads and tertiary roads. We talk about building schools, clinics, hospitals, manufacturing facilities, and so forth. Now, realizing that there was sort of a slowdown in implementation, and there were many barriers that were preventing private sector particularly to come on board, the African Union decided to establish what they called the Presidential Infrastructure Champion Initiative. This initiative then identified a portfolio of about 8 mega continental projects, and then nominated a head of state to be at the head and drive implementation of some of these projects. One of the mega projects that could result in significant construction work is the North-South corridor that comes from Durban, Richards Bay, going up through Zimbabwe, Botswana, into Zambia and the DRC. So almost half the length of the continent is going to be impacted. Ongoing studies are being carried out along these corridors, but there are also massive corridors in the east, the Lapset corridor that links Kenya to South Sudan and to Ethiopia. You have the North and many other projects here in ICT that the heads of state are currently championing. And there is a big push by African governments to accelerate the pace of implementation. Then when we come to talk about the construction and infrastructure development trends per se, Deloitte normally publishes every year what they call Africa construction trends. So I'm just looking here at the figures in 2018 and 2019, and driven by robust economic growth across Africa, the continent has really been witnessing significant inflow of investments into the construction and infrastructure sector. Now, according to this report, over 482 projects worth a total of about $471 billion broke ground by June the 1st, 2018. These projects were valued from $50 million up. In 2019, the figure jumped up a little bit. I mean, the number of projects were 452, so there were lesser projects, but in terms of value, it jumped to $497 billion. Now, what the transport sector accounted for over 22% of this project, so it's a significant player. And the reports also indicate to us who owns, who is building, and who is funding some of these construction projects across Africa. In 2018, the owners of most of these projects were African governments by 75%. The second was domestic private sector, and then they were followed by China, Australia, Middle East, and other countries such as the UK and the USA at less than 2%. When it came to funding as well in 2018, the governments, African governments contributed about 24.5%. International DFIs came in at second with 13.7%. China with 18%, domestic private sector by 10%. African DFIs contributed about 9.1% of that amount, followed by EU countries and other single countries. UK, USA, and others were below 3%. And South Africa itself in that year sort of funded about 1.2% of the $471 billion. Lastly, who is building strangely, but this is what is really happening in the continent. China leads with capturing about 33.2% of the build work in Africa in 2018, followed by domestic private sector with 23.9%, other EU countries and others with below 10%. So this was the state of affairs in 2018. When it came to 2019, you didn't really see much of change in terms of ownership. African governments still held the lion's share of that owned, followed by private sector, other single countries. China came in at number 4 with 2.4%. In terms of who is funding, African governments still funding the lion's share of that with over 22% of the 497 billion, followed by China, China with 20%, 20.4%, domestic private sector with about 10%, and then other international DFIs with about 10%. Everybody else then below that, below 10%. So this is the state of play. So, but what is important to highlight is really the fact that despite African countries and governments and private sector owning the lion's share and contributing much of the funding, when it came to build, China was actually leading. In 2019, this did not differ much. China captured about 31% of the build work, domestic private sector 23%, other EU countries about 8%, and then the Middle Eastern countries about 4%, and below that came others that were all below 5%. So in essence, between Africa and China, they were really the dominant players, but China was certainly leading in terms of the construction. But it also says a lot about the model of engagement that China utilizes, which requires the participation of their companies. Now, when it comes to the major growth nodes, where is economic activity? When we look at the continent and we look at where is high-level investment, private sector investment flowing into, we also start looking where is the economic growth continuing to increase significantly across Africa. We identified about 6 major nodes. In Southern Africa, at the bottom of the map of Africa, you have the North-South corridor that I mentioned previously because of the copper mine in Zambia and also in the DRC, and also the position of South Africa alongside that corridor is a major area of growth with tremendous potential for the construction industry. And then in the eastern, along the Indian Ocean, Mozambique is really beginning to step up because of the large-scale investments in the LNG projects by Total now, which was led initially by Nadako and also by ExxonMobil. So that area there is going to become a major construction hub over the next couple of years. And then if you're looking further along the Indian Ocean coast, Tanzania is also becoming into the play. The same with Kenya as well. I mentioned the Lapsset corridor being one. Uganda looking at oil and gas as well, the refinery that they're planning to build. There are significant investments in railway infrastructure, in ports, but also manufacturing and other industries that are beginning to unfold. And then when we go further up in North Africa, 4 countries really spring to mind there: Morocco, Algeria, Libya. Not Libya, forgive me. Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Egypt. Over $143 billion investment just in the Suez Canal alone. So it's quite significant investments and opportunities for the construction industry happening there. Coming a little bit down next to the equator, we're looking at West Africa, 4 countries there, the mega hubs there. Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Nigeria. All of them very well invested in the oil and gas sector with LNG projects happening, but also significant investment potential in railways, in power industry, in agriculture, and also manufacturing and general basic infrastructure development. And then coming a little bit down on the Atlantic coast, you're looking at Gabon, Congo Republic, also part of the DRC, Kinshasa, and a bit of Angola, but those have slowed down a little bit because of the drop in oil price. Now, when you look at all of these economic activities, since 2016, we have identified about $1.8 trillion worth of projects in this node since 2018. And the oil and gas, transport and power sector account for about 75% of declared value of projects. But these by themselves open up opportunity for agriculture, for urban development in terms of infrastructure, because many more larger number of African citizens are moving from rural to urban areas. So this increases demand for water, for paved roads, for housing, for schooling, for healthcare facilities, for water supply, and some other industries that are all associated with the construction industry. Offering significant growth potential. Now, lastly, how do we harness or facilitate partnership? One needs to understand that all the countries in Africa, allow me to risk saying so, are all pushing very hard to ensure that there is local participation in the construction industry across the board. There are huge demands in order to create jobs. So every company investing in the continent should not just looking at coming in, building and living. They need to start thinking about building local capacity, utilizing local engineers and technicians throughout their construction work. And also there is an insistence on import substitution. For example, in sourcing local raw materials rather than importing them from elsewhere. That in itself then creates opportunities for the manufacturing industry to supply cement, for example, to begin to grow, to supply and produce rebars, any other steel materials and windows and glass, and so many other inputs that are required across the construction industry is also looking. So if one is looking at the continent and looking at partnering, whether it's a South African company, a British company, an American company, it's important to have a more comprehensive and a low-key holistic perspective in terms of a value chain. So you start looking, and this is what African governments are insisting upon very strongly. You got to start looking also in terms of where do you source your raw materials? Are there sources of raw material supplies within the specific countries? How do you then help to develop that in order for the construction industry to continue to grow? One also has to start thinking in terms of strengthening the backward linkages, in terms of input, supply of capital goods. Africa does very little manufacturing of equipment for the construction industry. It needs to start looking at that, and that in itself creates investment opportunities for companies from around the world. Consumables is also one. One also needs to start looking at the spatial linkages that need to be created. And here we are talking in terms of the transport sector, the energy with the transport sector, with the corridors, what linkages it creates, because those are the channels through which goods and services can be supplied, be it energy and ICT. And with respect to ICT, really particularly with, in terms of the regional power pools that are being created. And at the bottom also lastly is knowledge linkages. Human resources development is very critical. And we are not just talking about your low labor force, but we're also talking about engineers. We're also talking your artisans and many other human resources capacity and skills that are needed to drive the construction industry. Africa continues to rely a lot significantly, specifically on those highly skilled levels on expatriate personnel, but African countries are becoming much more adamant in that, in the need for utilization of local labor force. In order to create a base, sufficient human resource capacity to drive those development. And lastly, forward-looking. So import substitution, as I said, is becoming increasingly important, be it from raw material processing, intermediate products, manufacturing, and creating the logistics and supply chain linkages. That's very important. Other factors of productions that investors or those wishing to do business in Africa need to start looking at is how do you begin to develop entrepreneurs? We have a very young population, very ambitious, who are eager not to just be employers or employees for other institutions, but they themselves are looking to get involved in doing business. And many of them very well qualified. How do we extract value from the land? We know that many African countries have required that land belongs to the state, but how do you value, how do you monetize land so that it makes investment in any construction activity much more attractive? And I believe that if we do all of this together and be able to be open and ensure that we increase local content in the construction industry in Africa, address some of those discrepancies that we see where we are owning most, we are funding most, but yet most of the construction is going towards others, and thereby allowing for capital flight to continue to increase. Those are things that one needs to consider, and governments around the continent are putting in place policies and measures to prevent that from continue to occur. Having said all of that, I would like to thank you all very much for the opportunity. Thank you.